Hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michelle Barnes. I am an associate professor at James Cook University here in North Queensland and the lead organizer for the special theme here at Sunbelt 2022. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our special theme keynote speaker, Professor Katrina Brown, who is joining us online from Exeter in the UK. Kate is a world-leading social scientist working at the interface of international development, environmental change, and sustainability. Her research focuses on how individuals and societies understand and respond to change and their different capacities for adaptation and transformation. She's a fellow of the UK Academy of Social Sciences and is identified as one of the most influential cross-disciplinary and social scientists on the 2020 and 2021 highly cited researchers lists. She's advised numerous international development and environmental organizations and has led many international collaborative research initiatives. Just as an example, she is the chair of the Scientific Management Committee for the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies here in Australia. Kate is author of the book Resilience, Development, and Global Change, which resulted from a UK Economic and Social Science Research Council Professorial Research Fellowship. In this book, she presents a revisioning of resilience for development. More recently, Kate was granted an inaugural AXA Outlook Award for her project, You, Me, and Our Resilience, where she worked with creative practitioners and communities to develop actions to build resilience to climate change. Kate describes herself as a feral social scientist and continues to research and write on environmental change, inequality, and resilience, and is active as an advisor to international scientific organizations and programs. Now, given that this is a social networks conference, it may come as a surprise to you that Kate is not a social network scholar. Instead, she has a wealth of knowledge regarding environmental change and resilience, some of it she's going to be sharing with us today, presenting a rare opportunity for social network researchers to gain knowledge of critical issues in the resilience and environmental change space, as well as conceptual and theoretical inspiration that could help to guide future social network research in this area. Without further ado, please join me in putting your hands together to welcome Professor Katrina Brown as she presents her plenary 3 Lessons from Resilience for the Climate Crisis.
That's great, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Michelle, and the organizing committee for inviting me, and especially for accommodating my remote participation. I'm really sorry that I'm unable to join you in Cairns, and I'm sure you're all having a wonderful time there. But thank you very much for attending this and listening to this presentation. So as Michelle has said, she gave me a very broad brief, really, to present some of my work around environmental change and society relating to this special theme, and particularly to talk about social dimensions of resilience, adaptation, and transformation. So today, what I'd like to do is to address the overarching question here. Can we be resilient to climate? Because of course, climate resilience is the focus of many initiatives, international action and programs. You know, at the moment, many millions of dollars are being invested in climate resilience, in climate resilient development, and it's written into, you know, major policy initiatives such as the SDGs, such as the IPCC. And what I want to do is to discuss what resilience scholarship tells us about how we might more effectively, more equitably, and more sustainably tackle the climate crisis, which of course we're seeing unfolding around us and around the world at the most alarming rate, with really devastating impacts at the moment. And really whether or not these insights can help us to deal more urgently with this global emergency. So what I want to highlight in particular is resilience as resilience to single or to multiple and co-occurring stressors. Resilience is a process, resilience is dynamic, and resilience as co-created and co-constructed collectively. So I'd like to start with an example. So I hope that this will give you a sense of why you as social network scholars might be interested in this talk, and also to illustrate some of the issues I want to present. So in the course of a wonderfully named project called MAGIC, Multi-Scale Adaptations to Global Change in Coasts, that worked in 4 different countries, we undertook empirical work in Southwest United Kingdom in the county of Cornwall. So that's very close to where I live and work. So amongst other things, we wanted to understand how resilience to anticipated impacts of climate change could be enhanced. And we undertook a whole series of surveys, of interviews, of workshops in 2 different communities. And we worked very closely with many different stakeholders in the county. So one of our study sites was this coastal village of Boscastle, which is on the north coast of Cornwall. It's a very picturesque place. It's a real magnet for tourists, but it's also a working fishing community. But it's very well known in the UK because it experienced a catastrophic flood in 2004. So this was a flash flood, which was the result of really unusual extreme rainfall event in the middle of our summer. So 10 years later, my colleague Lucy Faulkner interviewed people about their perceptions of community resilience. So 2 very interesting insights emerged from this. Firstly, people in Boscastle were confident that their prior experience of a flood would help them to deal with any future events. And secondly, when we asked them about what the key factors were to build resilience, our analysis revealed that sense of place and place identity were actually ranked as the most important precondition for resilience. So a sense of community and a shared identity and connections based on place were viewed as really crucial for resilience. And of course, this is important because, as you well know, community resilience is often highlighted as the strategy for disaster preparedness and response. This work also revealed resilience as a process and as a social process. And this diagram on this slide really illustrates that. So rather than resilience actually being the sum of a set of community characteristics or assets, actually it was this ongoing process of which place attachment was seen as the most important sort of precursor. And so this is what I want to explore a little further today. And I'm also really interested to ask you about how this relates to your own research and the work of social network analysts, particularly in relation to this conference special theme. So just a bit about my scholarship. My starting point really is the concept of resilience of a social ecological system, and that this is a very useful way of approaching and understanding change. So my work takes understandings from social ecological system science and from human development, incorporating fields such as development studies, anthropology, developmental psychology, and it also integrates work on disasters and disaster risk reduction. So as Michelle said, this is a very interdisciplinary approach. So building really on the work of, from different fields, scholars such as Cole Folke and others in the Resilience Alliance, of Anne Maston and Michael Rutter in developmental psychology, Michael Ungar in social work, and others, I understand resilience really as a process that increases the capacity of a system, broadly defined, to persist, adapt, or transform to a present or future disturbance. And I use this image here to illustrate my approach to social ecological resilience. And you might notice that the social is in bold here. This is a sculpture by the British artist Barbara Hepworth, and she spent much of her career actually in the southwest of England and in Cornwall, which is, as I said, where I've done a lot of work. And this piece is actually in the St Ives Sculpture Garden. It's called Forms in Movement, and it dates from 1957. And it's where Hepworth was exploring the strength and flexibility of metals. But of course, those of you who are familiar with the resilience literature will also notice that it's really similar in shape to the iconic adaptive cycle heuristic diagram that Buzz Holling presented again in the early 70s. But what Hepworth says about her work is also inspiring. She says, "I've gained great inspiration from the Cornish land and seascape, and the horizontal line of the sea, and the quality of light and colour which so excites one's sense of form. And first and last, there is a human figure which in the country becomes a free and moving part of a greater whole. This relationship between figure and landscape is vitally important to me." So Hepworth sees the human as an intrinsic part, a vital part of the landscape or system. And also her work signifies, you know, my human constructivist approach to resilience, and it encapsulates in a way my socially centered view of a social ecological system. So my work has explored this idea of everyday forms of resilience, and Michelle just referred to this book about 5 years, published about 5 years ago now. And in that, I developed really this focus on people's lived experiences of change, with the aim of really trying to integrate these understandings of how people can respond to change, both to the slow variables, you know, such as changes in values, and to the sudden events and shocks, such as a flood. And this idea of everyday forms of resilience, you know, puts the capacities that people, communities, social ecological systems have at the center of the analysis. And it follows from what the writer Rebecca Solnit talks about when she identifies social inventiveness, altruism, and solidarity as being the key characteristics of people's responses to disasters. So the three issues that are at the core of this vision of resilience are these three R's: resistance, rootedness, and resourcefulness. And these form the bedrock of what makes people, their communities, and social ecological systems able to respond effectively and often positively to change. So resistance really encompasses the contested, politicized nature of people's struggles and how they can respond to, negotiate, and mobilize for change. Rootedness accentuates the importance of place and the situated nature of resilience in highly dynamic contexts. And resourcefulness really emphasizes the capacities and the agency of different actors and their social ecological system to manage and shape change in both positive and negative ways. So I want to say a little bit more about how I use these concepts. So we can see that notions of resistance and resilience are related, and they're quite often actually understood as being the opposites, as being antonyms. But in practice, I think that they are interwoven, and a political ecology approach, which I would take, understands that resilience and resistance are actually potentially allied. Considering how resistance might be an element of resilience actually brings politics to the core of resilience, and it foregrounds power and agency. So resistance may indeed be a really important element of resilience, and this is particularly the case if we view resistance as a potential site for change and the means through which individuals can change social processes and structures and build alternatives. It's been very striking in a lot of my work that when I speak to individuals or hold focus groups and communities about resilience, people refer to resilience as a form of resistance. And whilst this in its sort of simplest form might imply the ability to resist change, actually in most cases what resistance refers to is the ability or the capacity of people to withstand external forces and to shape their own strategies. So resistance here implies strength, self-determination, agency and power. And in the social sciences, particularly in sociology and political sciences and human geography, resistance is generally understood as being concerned with undermining power relations, like the creation or the expansion of space for decision-making. And it's often understood to be oppositional, about the exploited against the exploiter, about the dominated against the dominator, or the oppressed against the oppressor. It's about the exercise of subordinate power. And resistance might also involve reforming cultural norms or challenging conventional values. Resistance is often associated with political or social movements or organized efforts by portions of civil society to resist and to disrupt order and stability. So it's about disruption. And of course, political scientist James Scott highlighted that most resistance is hidden, informal, and non-confrontational. So this is an important element that I felt was really underrepresented in discussions about social ecological resilience. So secondly, then, to look at rootedness, well, the geographer Asher Mean talks about situated resilience. And he asserts that the turbulent future will be addressed through the specifics of location. So my idea about rootedness really reflects this, and it emphasizes the power of place, community, and identity in resilience, just as that example from Boscastle highlighted. It reflects the strengths associated with belonging. But of course, rootedness is more than about place, partly because people are increasingly mobile. So it's about a much more fluid set of attachments and multifaceted identities. We can think about economic, environmental, and social rootedness and how that engenders sustainability, sustainable livelihoods, resilience, and subsidiarity. A number of studies, especially those led by Patrick Devine-Wright, one of my colleagues here in Exeter, and also Nadine Marshall, have shown that attachment to place and place-rooted identity can be powerful determinants of adaptation, resilience, and transformation. So our work with Nadine Marshall in particular has shown that place and occupational attachment might have a positive effect on adaptive capacity, but might actually constrain transformational responses to climate change. So there is this interesting dynamic between these different aspects and different facets of rootedness. And finally, resourcefulness is not just about the need for people to have access to resources to draw on, but it's also about their capacity to utilize them in the right place and at the right time. So it really questions how everyday forms of resilience can be actuated or made to work with different types of change and their implications for how decisions are made. It's about assets and access. It's about capabilities and agency, innovation, social learning, initiative. It's been shown in many studies, including, of course, by participants in this conference, to be a key component of adaptive capacity. So I want to consider how this socially informed resilience provides insights for dealing with the climate crisis and why I think it goes beyond the current sort of in vogue programming use of this catchphrase, climate resilience. So why might this be of interest to you as social network scholars? Well, I know that you're interested in connections and systems and structure, as I am, but I tend to use, I think, different methods and different terminology probably. So I thought it might be useful to very briefly just outline some of the conceptual underpinnings that inform my work and how this might relate to your very diverse interests. And these concepts, of course, are in turn related to diverse theoretical perspectives. So my approach as an environmental social scientist is primarily political ecology. And this means that I'm interested in social difference and intersectional inequalities and how they affect people's capacity to deal with change and the differentiated impacts of change and the interventions that are made to address them. I'm interested in agency and power relations, as I think I've already said, and the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own choices, and their ability to articulate and affect those choices within collective strategies, within collective settings and strategies. And I see these as being intrinsically linked to collective action. And furthermore, distinguishing between adaptation and transformation is also really critical to how we address the climate crisis. So who determines and enables and who is enabled, and how social relations and these factors of agency, power, collective action, as well as identity, attachments, and social difference each play a crucial role in this. And of course, connections and connectivity underpin all of these social relations. And so I hope that makes this meaningful for you. So I turn now to my 3 lessons from resilience for the climate crisis. So here's lesson 1. Climate is rarely experienced in isolation from other stressors. Of course, we've seen this, massive emphasis recently on the idea of, the perfect storm and this emergence of nexus studies. And, just 2 weeks ago, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, warned that humanity is facing a perfect storm of crises that is widening inequality between North and South. The divide is not only morally unacceptable, but it's dangerous, further threatening peace and security in a conflicted world. So the global food, energy, and financial crises that are being unleashed by the war in Ukraine have hit countries that are already reeling from pandemic, from the climate crisis, reversing what has been a growing convergence between developed and developing countries. So we know that climate is not the only crisis there. We know that the climate crisis is intersecting with these other major changes. Of course, foundational work in this area was initiated 20 years ago by Karen O'Brien and Robin Lachenko, when they challenged us to consider the impacts of climate change and globalization simultaneously rather than in isolation. So in a very influential paper, they introduced this concept of double exposure. And they presented this as a framework for examining the synergistic impacts of these 2 exposures. And importantly, they argued that the complex interactions between climate change and globalization would create new and uneven vulnerabilities across different regions, sectors, ecosystems, and social groups. So their double exposure framework highlighted the need to examine how these interacting exposures produce novel sets of impacts, often, of course, exacerbating existing marginalization and inequalities. So there's recent work, for example, has really highlighted how COVID, pandemic, and climate vulnerability have interacted to produce really horrifying incidents of gender-based violence, including forced and early marriage around the world. We know that poverty and climate change interact in really profound ways to exacerbate impacts. And this also means that it's important that we distinguish between the types of resilience that might be, that build system capacity to deal with multiple stresses, so general resilience, and specific resilience, which minimizes specific risks, and why this is important in terms of the kinds of interventions and strategies to build resilience. So a quick example here comes from some earlier work in coastal Tanzania, in northern Tanzania, where we actually asked fishing communities about how they were experiencing climate change. And what that revealed was that villages in the north coast of Tanzania were basically experiencing these multiple stresses and this kind of triple exposure, particularly to climate extremes, predatory industrial fishers, and then the creation of marine protected areas, which was cutting off their access to fishing grounds. So we can see that, and this is an illustration of one of the kind of mental models that was derived from this work, this sort of manifestation of these multiple and intersecting stresses, which of course had absolutely devastating impacts on the poorest people in these communities. And then some very recent work from the IUCN, which has been exploring these interlinkages between gender-based violence, climate vulnerability, and has identified this triple nexus of climate vulnerability, state fragility, and gender inequality, and has mapped internationally the prevalence around the world. So out of 122 countries, they found that this triple nexus was very high in 10 countries, and 29 countries had high prevalence, and then in further 42 countries had moderate prevalence. So this is really about how these intersecting risks are major factors in many, many different situations around the world. And of course, what they say is, well, these nexus issues are interlinked in terms of their dynamics and their prevalence. And that actually what we need is we need new approaches to finding solutions which are going to address root causes and which are going to be able to address how these factors work in combination, because we know the experience of programming in some areas actually further exacerbates some of these other factors. So, for example, interventions for environmental conservation have undermined gender equality in some places. So understanding the context-specific drivers and impacts of climate hazards, fragility, and inequality will help to develop better targeted and more effective interventions, it's hoped. So this really leads directly onto lesson 2, which is that resilience is multi-scale, it's multi-systemic, and it's dynamic. And resilience in different systems interact. So as that example, resilience at multiple scales interact. And of course, interventions in one scale or domain produce impacts, at other scales. And this helps to identify where and how to intervene. And of course, models from both social ecological systems, so Gunderson and Holling's Panicky, which is shown on the left here, and developmental psychology, this is Ingrid Schoon's developmental context systems model on the right, actually provide insights for empirical study of a dynamic adaptation and resilience across scales and systems through time. So this idea that there are these series of feedbacks and processes that work across both time and scale, whether it's a social scale or ecological scale. But what does this mean perhaps for how we deal with climate impacts? So again, another example from our MAGIC study, where we were able to show how adaptation at one site actually had important implications and knock-on effects for other areas. And we called this vulnerability transfer. And we used the robustness framework developed by Anders and Jensen and Ostrom as an analytical tool to understand how these critical feedback structures that underlie the dynamics of decision-making around coastal infrastructure are able to generate and co-produce knowledge with stakeholders to support policy processes, which actually uncovered these potential paths leading to maladaptive outcomes, and actually were able to suggest possible actions that could prevent them from occurring. So it exposes these different vulnerabilities across different scales of decision-making and across time and space. So the third lesson then is about resilience as a social process, rather than thinking about resilience as a state or an attribute or even a specific capacity. So I started my research career with a PhD examining women's collective action in farming groups in Eastern Kenya. And I was interested in whether the poorest or the most vulnerable actually benefited from collective action, how social learning and innovation happened through these groups, whether this actually enabled these women's households to become more resilient and to cope better with droughts. And of course, I realize now, 30 years later, that this was all about how resilience was constructed, how it was constructed through collective action, who is able to benefit and who is excluded from resilience as a social process. So who you are and where you are matters for resilience. And intersectional social differences are really critical, are crucial, because they determine power, agency, and access to decision-making and resources. Of course, much of the work on adaptation and adaptive capacity highlights this. And of course, Michelle Barnes has pioneered work in this area, showing particularly how social ecological network structures affect adaptive capacity through different domains, such as social learning, agency, and in turn, how this influences adaptive and transformative outcomes and action. And recently, there have been calls for more socially just resilience, to reflect this new emphasis really on social processes and intersectional inequalities, which really haven't been that prevalent, I think, in either the literature or in policy making around resilience. So I've become interested in how emotional and affective aspects of social relations relate to resilience. In a paper we published a couple of years ago now in Global Environmental Change, we proposed this empathy sustainability hypothesis. So building empathy in society and within the non-human world has been claimed to engender both pro-social and also pro-environmental identities and actions. In his book, The Empathic Civilization, Jeremy Rifkin makes the argument for empathy, particularly within the context of a globalizing world. He observes that human empathy is beginning to extend to all of life in the biosphere. And he suggests that this might give rise to the prospect of a truly global consciousness. So Rifkin's notion of global consciousness is presented as the only means of combating climate change and other global threats. So Rifkin says we need to shift global consciousness to actually deal with the climate crisis. And of course, empathy is also often portrayed as a means to acknowledge otherness and to transcend difference across spatial and social boundaries by creating mutual identities highlighted in, the human geography and the experimental psychology literature. So, we can see that empathy might well be a really important, tool for building resilience and for moving towards this shift in global consciousness that's necessary to really tackle the climate crisis. And of course, Rifkin has brought into focus the ability of humans to actually show solidarity with one another and with other species, and perhaps even go beyond this empathy for living things to the biosphere itself. So we proposed this empathy sustainability hypothesis to really expand on and build on existing work that had proposed some of these connections, but had failed to explain or to fully engage with many of the key challenges associated with empathy as a route really to human action. And so in essence, this is to suggest that empathy can provide a basis for overcoming some of the conventional dualism between humans and nature, potentially perhaps encouraging a more interdependent mode of engagement with the environment. So in this model, this hypothesis, empathy is mediated by place and identity, actually to affect sustainability. So just to give you a final empirical example, really, to illustrate these points. And Michelle referred to this project, You, Me, and Our Resilience. And in this project, we sought to understand how poverty and climate change interact and how they affect people's lives and livelihoods, how it affects what their options are, what their priorities for the future are. We wanted to learn from communities what they thought they needed to build resilience to climate change. We wanted to use creative methods to explore these issues with communities. We worked in two places, again in southwest of the United Kingdom, in Cornwall, and also on the southern coast of Kenya, and with two really fantastic collaborators, Safe Kenya and Golden Tree Productions. So in Kenya, we used Forum Theatre, which is otherwise known as the Theatre of the Oppressed. It was developed by Augusto Boal in Brazil in 1970, which is a means to give voice to marginalized and non-mainstream views, to challenge the status quo and jointly identify the causes and find solutions to people's problems. So the process, very briefly, is that we went to the community and asked, what are the key issues facing your community? We devised a play called Gangavazi based on these issues. And then the play is performed within the communities. And during the process of that performance, questions are asked of the community, and the audience is invited to take roles to explore different outcomes, the effects of different decisions, different actions, and then to co-create solutions. So in southern Kenya, in the process of these performances of Gangavazi, we learned a lot about everyday forms of resilience. We learned about resistance because the community told us that they need a voice and they need to be empowered. We learned about rootedness because they talked a lot about strong identities, especially as fishing communities, and their sense of place and the values that they associated with their place. And we learned a lot about resourcefulness, about building capacities and capabilities. But the thing that was highlighted by each of these communities, the thing that they said was the most important precursor for building resilience to climate was the need to educate girls. So people said, how can we build our capacities? How can we build resilience when we're only investing in half of our community? So there was a very strong message, which is we need to educate girls. We need to empower girls in order to face this crisis. And of course, this fits with, some of the different theories and concepts, and is finally making its way into some of the climate programming now. And we can, build on work such as this produced by Hani Ekin and colleagues, which really starts to tease apart how we can get into this top right-hand quadrant in this diagram of sustainable adaptation or more transformative change, rather than, focusing on specific capacities, which might, produce a kind of a safety first approach to responding to climate risks. But actually, the more transformative actions which will build generic capacity are focused on these issues around girls' education, community voice, local democracy, and so on. They are not technical fixes. They are about social processes and long-term change. So to conclude then, I don't think we can be climate resilient because resilience is a process. It's an ongoing process. And it's a dynamic process which is co-constructed and co-created by people through social relations. It's illustrated in this little diagram which was produced for a paper that's just been published, led by Tom Cheneau. Resilience is relational, it's about social relations. Connections and connectivity are crucial for this process, and I'm really fascinated to learn more about your views on this and your perspective as social network analysts on this, and hear more about your work. So thank you so much for listening to my my 3 lessons, especially after what I'm sure has been a long day for those of you who are in Cairns. I want to thank my collaborators, my co-authors, my co-researchers, my co-thinkers who've all contributed to the work and the ideas and findings presented here. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was wonderful. We will now take questions from both the in-person audience and the online audience. Any questions in the in-person audience to start us off? Looks like we have some already popping up online, so we might go there first.
So the first question is from Emma Church, who asked if your research indicates any ways to build empathy.
Thank you so much for that question. We touched on this a little bit in our work in Kenya and Gangavazi, and we talked a little bit about empathy and actually how the process of using forum theatre, which, as I'd said, then invites the audience to take on different roles. I mean, does, you know, very much ask people to, you know, stand in the shoes of others, which is what empathy is all about, and to start to, you know, see the world, feel the world from the perspective of others, perspective taking. So certainly I think the forum theatre as a process really does, really does, you know, ask people to do that. And I think you can see the transformational change that method actually has in terms of people then being, you know, able to see an issue from others' perspective and to think through the implications of decisions based on that. So I think the forum theatre method is a very kind of obvious way of, you know, building that empathy through asking people to take others' perspectives. I've also, in the last year, been involved in a really exciting project called the School of Hope, which was working with teams of young people in 5 different countries around the world, actually using creative practice again to build empathy amongst young people, which was, again, a really interesting experience because we had to do it online because of the pandemic. And as you can imagine, you know, young people have suffered so much because of the pandemic, because of the social isolation, which you know has affected them. That was very interesting because we talked a lot about how social media leads to forms of sort of performative empathy, because it means that you're exposed to different perspectives and you can empathize sort of online, but that's actually a sort of very shallow form of empathy. So I think that there's also ways that we can think about the kind of digital engagement, and that's what we started to do in the School of Hope. I'll find the link and put the link into the chat for you.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was great. It sounds like that's also a great way to have been building networks at the same time, and potentially even bridging or brokering between different types of networks, those types of formative experiences. So not only building empathy, but also networks, which is something all of us are probably interested in. I know you've given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure there are many more questions from the audience. I think, do we have an in-person question? We can switch off. Yep. Hike up the stairs here.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to ask, what role, I suppose, on more of a larger population-based level, do you think that sovereignty of a people plays in resilience and the ability for someone to maintain resilience in climate change?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite hear the first part of the question.
Just thinking more on a population level, what role sovereignty of a people plays in developing and maintaining resilience? Because I noticed one of your points was resistance. I thought that was interesting at a political scale.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's hugely important. I think that sovereignty in terms of rights to self-determination, in terms of, you know, rights to access a whole range of different resources are hugely important. And I think that there's a very interesting sort of emerging field of literature around, for example, Indigenous resilience, which I think kind of explores these issues quite explicitly. As a social scientist, I always tend to be drawn towards people's collective action in this and sort of social mobilization around responses to change. And I think that the kind of the merging of social movements around climate justice and resilience and sovereignty and rights is actually really, really interesting. And I think that that's where we're really seeing some of the, you know, the shift in the kind of international discourse around resilience is happening as a result of those international social movements and as a result of social mobilization around those issues. Does that answer your question?
He's nodding yes. So we're going to switch to the online audience, which I know have quite a few questions.
This is actually the last of the online questions. So if you have one and you're online, please post it now. So we have a question from David Tyndall. He says, right-wing populism can be thought of as a type of resistance. It has significant political consequences in a number of Western countries and elsewhere. Do you have any thoughts about how this type of resistance is related to resilience?
That's an excellent question. And it's a really tricky one. So I agree that I think we can see this, you know, I mean, resilience, resistance have both positive and negative, you know, manifestations. And I think that right-wing populism is actually a really, you know, good example of both a resistance in terms of that, I suppose, both the overt but also the covert pressure for, you know, shifts in power structures, but also the yeah, I suppose the kind of the various strategies that are being employed. I worry that actually those movements are highly resilient, that they are employing strategies, for example, around, you know, social media, digital technologies, which are, you know, so far-reaching and so profound that it's going to be very, very, very difficult to counter them. So I haven't thought specifically about what the key resilience lessons are, but I think that some of these, you know, some of these characteristics that I've talked about certainly the sort of multi-scale, cross-scale characteristics, about how these groups are building on, you know, multiple crises, are, if you believe some of the insights, are actually, you know, purposely sort of propelling and exacerbating the impacts of these crises, you know, building on food crises and things like that around the world to further their particular political views, then I think we should apply more of those lessons to understanding and combating, you know, these movements.
Thank you, Kate. We have another in-person question.
Thank you, Katrina. I think you may have already sort of partially answered this question, but I'll give it a go. So with the COVID crisis, we saw the world stop on its tracks, which sort of showed us that there's a way to do things and a more efficient way to do things. But with the climate change crisis, we don't see the same response. We see a slow burning process of multiple efforts that seem sometimes insufficient. Do you think we'll reach that point where the climate crisis is just unavoidable and we'll go into a sort of a catastrophic point where we'll see a response similar to the one that we saw with COVID? Or do you think that the long haul of our joint efforts can change this?
It's such a difficult question to answer, because I think that for many years, I really felt that we were going to be able to make sense of and make meaningful progress in tackling the climate crisis, or climate change, as we talked about then. I thought that, you know, we had the scientific evidence, we had the arguments, we had the roadmap of how to address climate change. And in my more optimistic moments, I want to believe that we still can bring around that transformative change to make a difference. I had hoped at the start of the pandemic that that shock to our system, you know, the global system, was going to, in a way, demonstrate that a different type of life and a different set of values and a different future was feasible. You know, I don't know what it was like for all of you people, but in the UK, we had 3 months where we heard the birds singing every morning because there was no traffic, you know. We had clear skies because there were no airplanes in the sky. I mean, it was quite amazing. We completely changed how we lived. And some of those things made us realize, you know, we don't all need to be driving cars every day or whatever. And I thought, this is going to give people a wake-up call and they won't be so scared of the transformation. But I've been so shocked and so despondent by actually the bounce back, you know. I mean, this is a really important lesson for resilience. The way in which, you know, the politicians have presented this, the way in which, you know, the types of interventions, and, you know, for the economy and so on that have been made, that have been so maladaptive and which now are actually just fueling the climate crisis. And we are in the midst of this crisis. This is no longer the future. The future is here, you know. I mean, people are dying as a result of, you know, the climate crisis. So I must admit that I have become much, much less optimistic. And I have really thought, yes, the only thing that is going to prompt any meaningful shift in, you know, the way our economies work, the way we produce our energy and use our energy, the way that we live our lives, what we value, the only thing is major catastrophe, because I think we've had warnings over and over and over again. I mean, you know, we're in the midst of a massive heat wave here in Western Europe. I mean, we're having record-breaking temperatures. It's, you know, it's predicted to hit 40 degrees in southern England next week. That has never been experienced. And I just think we're not heeding these warnings. So I'm afraid that I would like to think that we had learned lessons from the pandemic, but I don't think we have. I think we're desperately on the edge of the cliff and we're starting to go over. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic.
Thank you, Kay, for that. We have one, I think if you don't mind, we'll take one last question from the online audience and then let you go since it's getting a bit late.
This question is from Lorian. Thanks so much, Kate. Do you have any advice for our social network early career researchers who are very eager to make a difference both for scholarship and practice?
Well, I think you do the best work that you can. And I think that you work with the people that you want to work with, that you think are going to make a difference. And you don't get too hooked up on citations, and you don't get too worried about, you know, those elusive journals that you're supposed to publish in. And I know that's really, really difficult, because I think that we have to change the way in which career structures work. But actually, you do excellent research, you work with excellent people, and you publish where you think you're going to, you know, your work's going to get read by the people that you want to read it. And that might not be, you know, the journals that have the highest citations. And I don't think you should get too hooked up on that, and take the long view. You know, I think that it's tough being an early career researcher these days. I mean, much, much tougher than when I started out. And you know, I told you about my PhD research in Eastern Kenya, which has been so influential throughout my career. And I reflect back on it now, 30 years later, and I think, yeah, you know, I had all of those ideas in there, and it's taken me 30 years to start working these out. But, you know, I never got a thing published from my PhD. I mean, I could not get a job these days on the back of that, you know. And I think that, you know, we've become obsessed with the metrics and all of these, you know, measures and citations and the numbers of publications, but you have to do the work that's meaningful to you and work with the people who you think really matter and who make a difference. And in the long term, that will really hold you in good stead, I believe. So good luck.
Thank you very much.